So this is a type of hand that's really hard to play. The thing that I wanted you to focus on, where are my opponent's bluffs coming from?
Like, I think that's a lot of time people are just looking for a comfortable situation or a comfortable reason to fold 7-8 here, but it's not because you just want to fold because somebody has it. It's because there's other better hands to call. What's up guys, Lex Veldhuis here and welcome to another installment of our BBZ training material. In this one, we're going to talk about aggression and facing aggression after we defended the big blind. It's very hard when you defend correctly from the big blind, meaning you're going to have a lot of marginal hands to face aggression post-flop. So let's take a deeper look into when we should battle that aggression and when we should step aside. Definitely something very valuable for me and something that I learned from a lot. Now, also as a good side note for you, there is a Black Friday sale going on BBZPoker.com, which means that if you do want to engage in some of this training material yourself, you have 50% off this week. Make sure you like and subscribe if you appreciate the video. Check out the other videos as well, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace. Yeah, I mean, it's a very large bet, but I feel like on these boards, especially with, I mean, we looked at these models a lot. I'll be curious to hear how much it changes based on his bet size, because that is a pretty big bet sizing.
Yep.
But at the same time, he's also going to use bets like that, and I think that this is one of those where we just categorize never folding ace-x, never folding queen-x, probably never folding 6-x on the turn, and then we start folding 3-x's on the turn. But I don't think that I'm supposed to fold this.
So you're right and you're wrong, and like you're missing something that's really important. So why are you right and wrong? So first of all, you can't pure fold the whole 6x block. Okay, so why not? So like, because I think that you get this pretty quickly because you're good at this. But some of the people that are watching, they maybe it's helpful to understand like why does Lex think a pair of sixes is a good hand here, right? So first things first, we have 35 BB. Okay, so a lot of our really strong ace-x hands are going to be capable of getting it in pre-flop, right? Like ace king and ace queen and ace jack. Like a lot of those hands are gone. There's no ace jack suited flatting here. If you're like newer to the game, you might think that's a good idea. You just 3-bet it. If a guy jams, you call. So we don't have a lot of the really strong ace-x hands. Now, whatever the strongest ace-x hands are that we do have, whatever they are, it's probably ace-10 or something. Whatever that is, we're going to check raise that on the flop. Ace-10 is not going to be a call here. It's going to be a raise. So that means we're going to have very few ace-x hands left once we call here. Now, we're not going to have none. Okay, that's not the same thing as saying I have none. It just means I have less. All right. So at this point, we don't have, bottom two pair much. We would check raise it on the flop. We don't have ace-10 much because we would check raise it on the flop, and we don't have ace-queen at all because that's impossible. So we can't now. At the same time, this math when someone basically he's betting pot, it's a little bit bigger, but roughly speaking, it's pot. When he bets like this, we're gonna have to defend 50% of whatever our range is. Roughly speaking, that's gonna be how it works. So that's the interaction between this person's bet size and our fold percentage. So we're going to be folding, I don't know, maybe 55% to be more technical. So that means Lex has to think about all the different hands he can have and then defend half of them. Okay. Now you're going to be able to fold hands that don't have any kind of reasonable equity. You can kind of dismiss those as not even being really a part of the range. But for the most part, it's not an unreasonable assumption to be like, okay, I have to defend 45% of all of the possible hands I can have here. Occasionally that's going to be queen X of clubs. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be an ace. But mostly that's going to be like, if I have to defend 45% of all my hands here, I have to defend a decent amount of 6s and 3s. I can't fold them all. Okay. And there is a linear kind of order to this. It's better to call a pair of aces, and then it's better to call a pair of queens, and then a pair of 6s, and then a pair of 3s. Now there's a disproportionate improvement if you block where your opponent's value is going to come from. So ace deuce is much better than like king queen, for example, as a call. It's not just a little bit better. It's a lot better to have ace deuce than it is to have king queen. Okay. And now when we have 6-5, we have a bluff catcher. It's not that good, but it's not that bad. We can't pure fold this type of a hand against this bet size, but we're not going to be pure calling this either. So this is a type of hand that's really hard to play. It's just, it is what it is. Now, the thing that I wanted you to focus on that you didn't say is like, where are my opponent's bluffs coming from? And it's pretty clear where they're coming from. He's opening the button. So we know, because we've been working with Lex on this for a while, we know what's the bottom of the button's opening range, Lex.
Suited 5s and offsuited 8s.
Okay, correct. So So suited hands make up much smaller fraction of the opponent's range than the offsuit hands, right? So the bluffs have to come from offsuit eights or better, primarily, right? 8, 9, 10, jack, right? That's where the bluffs are going to come from. He's less likely, your opponent here is less likely to bluff with king high because it has some showdown value against Lex's busted draws, okay? So it's got an opportunity cost in checking, essentially, is how you think about king high, whereas jack high doesn't, or 10 high doesn't, not really, right? So your opponent's bluffs will come from 8s, 9s, 10s, jacks. We make those bluffs available when we have a 5. Okay. Now, would we rather have 6-4? We would. Why? Lex already told you why. Because some of the bluffs come from suited 5s. So 6-4 is probably better than 6-5. But 6-5 is probably better than 6-8. Or 9-6. Or 10-6. So we can kind of identify which 6s suck. The 6s that are really bad would be like 8-6, 9-6, 10-6, jack-6. The 6s that are really good would be like 6-deuce and 6-4. 6-5 is like pretty reasonable. Pretty reasonable. Is it amazing? It's not amazing. It's okay? It's okay. And the guy's betting like, so this is a mix. That's what I would assume. I would assume that this is a mix. You have to call sometimes. You can fold a little bit, but you're gonna have to call like at a decent clip. And I would pure fold 10-6. And I would pure fold jack-6, right? And that's the exercise you walk yourself through to answer the question, because you can't just call with all the 6s, and you can't just fold them all.
Yeah.
So you have to build a like a system that can handle organizing what to do with a pair of 6s. And the best system that I know of is just asking yourself like where your opponent's bluffs are coming from. Now, conversely, you could say where's your opponent's value coming from? That's something that people like to focus on. That it's going to come from ace X, and the issue is that it comes from a lot of ace X. So it can come from like he can probably do this with like ace 5 or ace 7 or ace 8 or ace 9 or ace 10 or ace jack or ace king or like sets of 6s or sets of 3s. It's much more obvious where the bluffs are coming from and how to block those or how to unblock those. So yeah.
That's a good point. I don't think I like, yeah, that's a very good refresher as well.
Nice. Pretty standard. A little bit shallow here. How do you think about this?
It's a good size bet. We are 30 big blinds deep. So I think again, this will come down to characteristics of our hand and how it interacts with their range. I would think that bluffs come from 10x, jack x, king jack, king 10, spades. I mean, in that sense, my hand's pretty good. I mean, but at the same time, like I block some club combinations that miss, that could barrel, but
Yeah, so I'm gonna jump in here just for a second, and the reason I'm gonna jump in here is because I'm gonna show you why poker is hard. So the reason poker is hard, and this again mostly for everybody else, you already know that this is hard. This game's hard. The reason that this game's hard is because what we used in this example is what we did was we built a system that can organize what to do with a pair of 6s. Okay. Now, if we use that system here, here's the issue. You said correctly that the bluffs are coming from like king jack, king 10, probably ace 10 or ace jack, right? Jack 10's already a straight, so they can't come from the jack high hands. Can't come from the 10 high hands because those would be pairs like 10-9 or 10-8. So there's no 10 high bluffs, there's no jack high bluffs. So the king high bluffs is the first place that your opponent could bluff from, which means having a king in your hand's probably not very good, by the way. But the issue is that when you say king 10 and king jack, the problem with the 10 and the jack specifically are that when you have a 10 or a jack yourself, you would block where the bluffs are coming from, but those are just way better hands. It's 9-10 is just a way better hand because it's got a gut shot. Jack 9 is just a way better hand because it's got a gut shot. So you've got to be careful about how you use the system to organize the pair of 9s here, because 9-10 and jack 9 are actually better hands than 9-4. But it's because they have more equity. It's not because of like where the fact that they block or unblock bluffs or value bets or anything like that. It's just they're actually better hands. They actually have more equity against the betting range. Now, incidentally, using the system, I would say that king 9's probably the worst. King 9's probably one of the worst nines. The problem is your opponent probably value bet pretty thinly, and king 9's getting kind of close. So this one's much more difficult to organize than the last one. But we're still going through the exercise of trying to organize it. I think this is probably okay to fold. Why do I think it's okay to fold? Because I think 9-10 and jack 9 are just better hands than this. I think you can also probably have hands like 10-8, at least with clubs, but probably just 10-8 in general. Same thing is true about jack 8. And those are also better hands. So I think that you could probably fold this against this size. So I think this is pretty reasonable. But this one's a little bit trickier, so I wanted to step in before, because this one's like, some of them will just be tricky. I mean, like I said, poker's hard. I mean,
it's really fucking hard. I mean, you could tell as well, like, once I feel like when you're playing, you get into some sort of like flow state, and a lot of it feels natural, but it's so, whenever I would do way back in the day and some of my friends would start playing, or somebody the only thing I would literally ask them while they were playing is just like, why? It's like, okay, so explain. And they would just be doing, they would just, okay, so I bet the flop, and I would just go, why? And then sometimes
Yep.
even that is, well, because I raised pre-flop. I was like, okay, that's not a good reason. Why did you bet the flop? And then you see that, and there it stopped, It's just such a hard thing if you really want to get down and decipher why. And I'm so glad that these two hands followed each other up, because it's like the method of organizing was like the reverse, Like sometimes we just have to call with hands that have equity. Yes, sure, they block some bluffs, but equity is important. So that's a good reminder.
Yeah. No. All right. And yeah, they were two good hands to go one after the other, because they did kind of contradict each other a little bit. So, it's another hard one.
Yes. Fucking hell. Okay, so our opponent bets 2/3. We're 30 big blinds deep. Big blinds versus cutoff. I think that our 9 is very bad here. I think I think the 9 of spades is especially bad, because I think that's actually where quite a bit of bluffs come from. In terms of equity, so let's look at that too, of course. In terms of equity, I think the 9 is sort of useless, because if we hit a 9, then our opponent can have a straight, and hitting a queen actually completes a lot of our opponent's bluffs, I think. So I think that I think a reasonable part of our opponent's range bluffs come from the 9x or ace-x. So I would just fold this.
I don't actually know what to do with this one.
Good.
So so I don't actually know the answer. I would assume it probably calls, but I don't know if that's a good idea or not. Maybe it's not. This is really hard for one reason in particular, which is that we're short. So because we're short, we don't have as much top pair. So this is something that Lex and I are also working on behind the scenes. So is check raising more top pair in Lex's strategy at shorter stack depths. And so at 25 BB, as you know now, Lex, there's going to be a lot of check raise from this King X block.
Yeah.
There's going to be a lot of check raise in this King X block. And that's going to mean that most of your range is a pair of 10s on the turn. And obviously you're going to have a pair of jacks as well. This is probably going to be the type of card where your opponent can bet range, if I had to guess. Why? Because this type of card subtracts most of your opponent's bluffs from their range. So they're going to interact with this card so well, they can probably bet most of the hands in the range. Maybe they can't bet all of them. Maybe it's only 70 or 80%, but it wouldn't surprise me if it's all of them. Yeah, I mean, like, I'd rather call with 10-9 than 10-8. Obviously, you'd rather call with Queen 10. I'd rather call with Queen 3 than 10-9, which is a good argument for folding 10-9. But, like, I'm going to fold 10-8. I'm going to fold 10-7. I'm going to fold 10-6. So maybe it's a mix. It seems really close. I don't actually know the answer. This one's really hard to deal with. And let's go ahead and figure this out together. So this bet is basically 6/9, which is basically 2/3. So we're going to look at a 67% bet on the following straight here, which we already have in the model. And it's splitting between 67% and a smaller size. I don't think that's really reasonable. Because I don't know that many people would go with the smaller size. As you can see here that it's a 75% bet. I said maybe it would bet 80, maybe it would bet range. If it's betting 75, it's kind of close. So I'm going to pull this 40% bet, because I don't think that it's something that, like, is obviously the case that people will be utilizing if they're using a 2/3 sizing choice here. So we'll go with 2/3 is their only bet sizing choice, and you can see that it is a fold primarily. You can see that it's really fucking close though, because I mean, like, if it mixes at all, it's gonna be pretty close. So it is kind of close. These ones are pretty easy to fold. These other versions of the hand were pretty easy to fold. But yeah, it is. We do get to fold this. You guys can see how close this is though. Like, this version's minus 0.03 big blind. So that means that folding is worth 0 and calling is worth -3. So that's very close. To put it in perspective, Queen Jack is worth 327 big blinds per 100, right? So, like, that's a good hand. Queen Jack is a good hand. It's worth 327 big blinds. 10-9's a bad hand, and it's not worth some huge negative number. It's worth -3 big blinds. So that's why Lex and I are struggling. The reason we're struggling is because this hand is so damn close to being worth 0. And that's why, one version of this hand is mixing, because it's really close to being worth 0. But this version, you can see, like, this version, like, the 10-8's probably a better version to look at. Like, this version's worth a larger negative number, because 10-8's worse than 10-9. Yeah, so very close hand. I'm looking at some of the other hands here. So, like, where's Queen 3 suited? So here's Queen 3 suited. I told you guys that this would be a better hand, for example. Like, we would much rather have Queen 3 suited than 10-9. And I said that is a reason for folding 10-9. And the reason I say that is because an analogy that's I think a lot of people who haven't dedicated their life to poker find helpful is like a sports analogy. And I think a lot of people played sports, so they can kind of relate to this. If you think about, like, a soccer team, a football team, there might be like 11 slots on the team. I might embarrass myself with how many slots are on the team, but let's just assume that there are 11 slots on the team, and let's just assume that 22 people try out. So you're going to cut 50% of the people, right? And that's basically what we're doing when we're trying to play good poker. Your opponent chooses a bet size, and then right, and so the bet size against 2/3 we can actually solve for, independent of the solution that we have in front of us. So if our opponent bets 67, the total pot after their bet will be 167, which corresponds to a 40% fold. Okay, what fold did we see in the model? We saw a 41% fold. So there, you can see that there's a strong relationship between these two numbers. Okay, so the fold percentage is already decided. So you can think about that in the sports team as like the number of players you have to cut from the team, right? And then you have your range, and you're going to cut 40% of that range out. And that's determined by the bet size that your opponent's going to use. And then your job as a professional poker player is to select the best 60% for the team. Same way that you would do if you're building a soccer team, football team, whatever, right? So, and we have to, and we do that based on the best blockers. We do that based on equity. We do that based on blocking where our opponent's value is coming from. We do that based on unblocking where our opponent's bluff are coming from. But our job is to identify the best 60% of hands in this range. That's our job. The fold percentages, I know that for a lot of people who don't study poker, the math's really difficult and really complicated. But the math's super fucking easy. Like once you get the hang of this, it's really easy, and so it's very repeatable. What's harder, so it's easy to know for me that the fold percentage is going to be 40%. It's much harder to know which hands am I supposed to use to make up the 60% of hands that have to call. And again, that's kind of like when you're building the sports team, it's kind of like, you get the 22 guys to try out. Now you have to cut half the team, and you need to pick the best players. And your job is to make sure you actually pick the best players. Pick the fastest guys. Pick the guys that have the best striking, can put the most. I'm going to stop with the soccer analogy. You get the fucking point. So yeah, so that's kind of like how it works, right?
Yeah, and it's also like it's like you shave off a bit here and there. When you have to estimate, it's actually reasonable, a reasonable exercise. So when you have to estimate, you actually get, like, let's say you have to defend half. It's so easy which half you discard a lot of the times.
Yeah, very frequently. Very frequently. Not all the time, but
no.
Very frequently, yeah.
And it's also a good exercise because a lot of people, like when they ask me, they ask me about a turn call, and they're like, oh, why? An example yesterday, the flop was 10. The flop was 10-9-4, and I call with a 9, and the turn, and somebody bet rather large, and I call with a 9, and the turn is an ace, and they bet again, and I called, and somebody asked like, why do you call again? I was like, well, I had a 6, so I unblock all of his bluffs, like around the Jack, Queen, 8. And I don't think that they bet very big with an ace, so on the flop. So a large part of their ace section is gone, right? So sorry, I don't defend with an ace. Oh man, I hate it when you make mistakes when you try to be clear about something, So then you already know I don't have that many aces. Okay, so that part of my range is gone. So that makes the range completely different. We're 20 big blinds deep, so I would actually raise some of my 10x. Okay, cool. So I don't have much 10x either. All right, I really need to work with my fucking 9s here, because my range just doesn't have that much other stuff in it.
Yeah. Yep.
Sorry if that was super unclear, but
no, I got it. Yeah, in the end, I got it for sure. So, but yeah, that makes sense the way that you described it. Just a big bet again. Okay, this is like reasonable. I don't know if this is going to come in against a larger bet, but it's not stupid, right? I mean, like this card produces asymmetric straights, like hands that fill out that are the nuts that we have that this guy cannot have. So this is like a scenario where leading is reasonable. It just might be harder when he bets this large on the flop.
That's a good thing to keep in mind, yeah.
It's not a stupid idea. And then how do you think about folding? How do you think about the river decision?
I mean, I don't mind using this part of my range to blast with on the river, but I just think that of the hands that we can lead for value, I think they get cut so hard because of the 4 counterfeiting our 2 pairs that I don't think we get to use it as much to just fire the river off.
Yeah, I would never have bluffed the river. I'm actually just strictly talking about evaluating hero calling here.
I mean, in terms of hero calling, like the deuce is probably really fucking good. Mm-hmm. Best card we can have. Yeah, I mean, it's a fair point.
Yeah, so I mean, I would be thinking about, where the opponents. Okay, so let's talk about what's happened, right? So okay, so this guy bets big on the flop. That's a little bit intimidating, but it's probably appropriate a lot of the time on this type of board. So I think it's a good idea. Where's the value going to come from when someone does this? Probably jacks and tens, queens, ace nine, king nine, suited obviously with king nine, queen nine suited, etc. So top pair, over pairs. That's most of it.
Yeah.
To call, that's cool. That's the reason why I don't know that leading this turn is going to be on the table. Is because that value still looks like really strong. So, but I mean, it's not like a bad lead, so it's okay. And then we get to the river and we check, which I think is a good idea. And why do I think it's a good idea? Because the draws didn't fill. So whatever we were bluffing with on the turn is still a bluff now. So you could bluff with that. And this is a medium strength hand, so I'm not going to bluff with this. So he checked, which is good. And now we just have a medium strength hand and the guy bets. So, you know, like when he has value, I think it's pretty easy to come up with how you lose. If he has value, you lose to jacks, you lose to queens, you lose to king nine. Now, interestingly, some of those could probably raise the turn against a small lead like this. So if he has jacks or tens, or queens, he could probably 2-bet. But he didn't, which might mean that he's more likely to have a pair of nines, or a bluff. And I do think that like it's reasonable for someone to be bluffing here with like clubs. I think it's reasonable for someone to be bluffing here on the flop like this with like jack 10, with queen 10, with queen jack, with king 10 maybe, probably less ace highs. And so when you lead the turn this small, I think you're going to get calls from like the king 10s and the queen 10s and the jack 10s and things.
Yeah.
So I think you get those calls. And then when you check this river, those hands bluff. So, you know, like we make those bluffs pretty available. I think this hand is like on the table to hero call with.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's like necessarily pure, but I do think it's totally reasonable. I think you want to stay away from like a 5. I think this hand like meaningfully outperforms 6-5 because your opponent doesn't have like 8-5 for value, obviously, when they open from this position.
Mm-hmm.
But they do have, and they don't have 9-5 for value when they open from this position. But they do probably have like ace-5 that they may want to bluff with. You know, some players might have ace-5. Some players might have like king-5 suited if they open, which is a bit of a wide open, but it's not impossible, and they would bluff with that. So I think you probably want to stay away from the 5. I think having like a deuce or a 3 is pretty good. It's not that obvious if a jack or a 10 is bad. I would assume it's bad, but it depends really on like how dense this range is, jacks and 10s, and like how often he's raising the turn with jacks and 10s. That's going to determine whether or not having a 10 or a jack is like really bad or like kind of bad. But yeah, I think it's like an interesting hand.
Yeah, for sure. Like, I mean, just seeing it, it's like the way I'm playing it and I'm just folding it is almost like I'm playing for the value of the hand and I'm not thinking about the turn interaction to the lead.
Sure. Yeah.
I do think that humans, if you look at models, what people are supposed to do versus small leads, I think people underraise the turn heavily because they're so afraid of, you know.
100%. I agree with that. That's why I said that he might raise with jacks and 10s, but I didn't think he would raise as much with jack 10.
Yeah.
Even though he's probably supposed to. He's probably supposed to, but I think that he's much more likely to call with jack 10. And then jacks and 10s are like maybe a little bit easier to find as raises, but yeah, I agree with that 100%. All right. Ugh, this is pretty gross. So, how do you think about the flop?
I think we're above the thresholds. Like generally, I think that above 35 big blinds, there's a lot less check raising with top pairs. I think it's important to note that we're up versus the cutoff, which is a very wide range. So that would obviously increase our check raising. I think that once we check raise, we do it hierarchically, kicker wise. So that the fact that we're in the middle of the pack, even though the 8 has some good qualities, and is more resilient over future streets than some other cards, still I think that because we're so deep, because the bet is big, and because we have our kickers in 8, we don't check raise this one.
So that's all really good. I would say that one of the things is when the pair is below a 9, the hierarchical component's probably less important. So, and that's because like your opponent doesn't have many pairs of 7s, right? So as the pairs get lower and lower, so as we move from like a pair of aces where he has a lot of those to a pair of like deuces where he has almost none of those, the kicker doesn't matter much if you have a pair of deuces and you're thinking about something, right? Because he's not going to value bet a pair of deuces, right? So when you're evaluating check raising a pair of 7s for value, it's not like your value is going to come from a pair of 7s from the other guy. So it's a little bit less significant. Obviously, you're everything you said though was spot on. Like there's lots more raising at 35 BB and less. We're getting a little bit deep. We're still kind of close to that stacked up, so it's a little bit hard. This is the solution here against a 60% bet, which is what your opponent did, roughly speaking. So you can see that 7-8 is actually check raising quite a lot. 7-6 is still check raising quite a lot. You can see that it's not a clean hierarchy though. It's not like a7 to king7 to queen7 to jack7. Like it doesn't work that way. So a7 matters, which makes sense because they have like king7 suited and stuff. So a7 does matter, but like king7 versus 8-7, there's actually more check raise from the 8-7 block than the king7 block.
Is that also just because there's like more turns with equity for you, or is it like
probably,
an investment in the
future?
future?
This matters too. Yeah, I would assume this matters. Yeah, like you check raise the flop, he calls, and the turn's going to be pretty good more often when you have 8-7 than when you have 10-7. I mean, if it turns a 6 or a 4 or a 9, like, those are all pretty decent turns for 8-7, but like pretty mediocre turns at best for 10-7. So yeah, I would say for sure that matters. But yeah, these are reasonable check raises, which is what I thought. That's why I mean I asked the question for a reason, you know. So yeah, I think it's a reasonable check raise. It doesn't mean you have to. It's a mix, but it's reasonable. This is going to be pure call, not close.
Okay,
that's good.
Thank God.
Yeah, we can also fold the river. Okay, so in the filter. So how do you think about this now? That you're here.
I mean, this is. I would say that this is just a math proposition, right? They bet pot, so we have to call half the time.
Mm-hmm. With the hands that beat bluffs, very specifically.
Yeah.
At this point, it's going to be very cleanly 50% of the hands roughly that beat bluffs. A little bit more than 50 because he's betting a little bit less than pot because you have 25 and there's 30 in the middle. But yeah, that's the idea.
I mean, I do have to say, like, I do think we get to the river quite a bit with, like, from the turn, I think we get to the river quite a bit with hands that beat bluffs, right? There's no backdoor flush draws. It's impossible for us to have a hand like 10-8. I think, like, hands like ace-6 or something might be in there. But ace-6, maybe ace-8 with a backdoor draw or something. Both of those. King. Well, actually, there's still, you know, hands like king-6 of spades and stuff, but... But then, if we look at hands that beat bluffs, this one probably gets in there, I think. Because, you know, calling with a 7 is more efficient than calling with a 5 and a deuce. And that's, you know, a lot of our check calling on the turn also happens with those two pairs. Yeah, I think it actually makes the cut. If you think about 50% that beats the bluffs, I think this one gets in there. It's really hard. It's really hard. It's like, we don't have 10-9, you know?
Yep.
Yeah, I would say I would have to, and I don't think it's a mix either. I think this one has to be in there pure because I struggle to find other hands. You know, like think about because somebody could say, well, you could have 8s. No, because you 3-bet pre.
Yeah, there's no 8s here.
Yeah, so I'm just saying, like, yeah. Also, you know, for audience, it's like this is one of those spots where you just have to think, oh yeah, but what about a7? No, because that's one we would check raise always. You know, so it's not in there. So we really have to think about like what is the range we get to the river with, and I mean like most of that's going to be 7s, 5s, and deuces, so this one is automatically in there. I think that 8-5 would be a much more interesting, much more of a decision and thing to really crunch down, but like 8-7 just feels like if we're folding this, then what the fuck are we calling? We're just getting pummeled.
Yeah, so okay, so let's go. So let's just walk through it. So, so on the flop, it's close to a check raise. So, but we're gonna have a pair of 7s, 5s, and deuces primarily. That's what we're calling the flop with on a board like this. We'll have some draws, but this is gonna be a big part of the range. On the turn, we do have some hands like that hit this pair of 9s, right? So we are gonna have like some 9-6s, some 9-8s. So we do have some interaction with this pair of 9s, which is helpful. He barrels, we call. Now, we're also probably going to have a non-zero raising component with the pair of 9s because we're relatively short. We have a 1-to-1 SPR, and a pair of 9s still gets some protection and can probably get called by worse. So it wouldn't surprise me if, like, you know, we had the king 9 of hearts or something and we checked jam the turn. I wouldn't be really surprised by that at all. And now we get to the river, and so like you can't like get here with something other than what you actually have in the range, right? You're going to get here with a pair of 7s, 5s, and deuces. That's just the reality of the situation. Yeah. And you have to defend more than half the range. So, I mean, the idea that you're going to be able to pure fold a pair of 7s here is like just ridiculous. You can't pure fold a pair of 7s here. That's very obvious. So that means that, again, to go back to the team analogy, we're going to have to, like, the pair of 7s is competing. And the job is to find which ones are going to be pure calls. And the pair of 5s is pretty reasonable here. Why is a pair of 5s reasonable here? Because do you think this guy's triple barreling a pair of 7s here for value? Mm-hmm. Think he's going to like bet the flop at the turn and jam over the pair of 7s? Probably not. Maybe he could do that with a7 specifically, but like probably not. So if that's the case, then if it's the case that he's not value betting a pair of sevens, then what's the real fundamental difference between a pair of sevens and a pair of fives on the river? There's no difference. If he's value betting, you lose.
Yeah.
If he's not value betting, you win, right? So the pair of sevens and the pair of fives are pretty similar. So the question really is, what are the best kickers to call with? Now, interestingly, that same idea that I just used is going to make more 7x fold. If 7x and 5x are basically the same hand, then 7x has a lot of competition from 5x. Right? So that means that a 5 with a good kicker is going to meaningfully outperform a pair of 7s with a bad kicker.
This is not a great kicker because this is where some of his bluffs might come from, correct?
Probably. Yeah, I would say so. He's bluffing with offsuit nines, which means like that's helpful, but he does have king 8 offsuit specifically as a mix. Obviously he's got suited 8s in pretty heavy supply, but as an example, king 5 offsuit is going to be a better call than 7-8 offsuit. I don't think that's going to be very close because I don't think this guy's supposed to bluff with like king jack or something on this river.
Yeah.
So I think king 5 off is a way better call than 7-8. But when we fold 7-8, we have to understand that we are doing it to call with king 5.
Yeah. That's the biggest leap that people won't take, right? Like,
Yeah,
I think that's a lot of time people are just looking for a comfortable situation or a comfortable reason to fold 7-8 here, but it's not. It's not because you just want to fold because somebody has it. It's because there's other better hands to call.
Yeah. So this is a tough one though. I would definitely say that 7-8 would come in as a call before 10-7. Right. That's what I would, like for me personally. I would feel much more comfortable calling with 7-8 before 10-7 because your opponent's bluffs are coming from, again, your opponent's offsuit component of your opponent's range is offsuit 9s plus. Well, there's a 9 on the board, so that where's the bluff going to come from? Probably someone with a 10 in it a lot, right? So I don't really like a 10-7. I don't really like a jack 7, but I do like a queen 7. I like a queen 7. I like a king 7. Obviously, I like an a7 if we could have it, but we would check raise the flop with that pure. So we don't have it. But that's sort of how I think about it.
Fucking hell, like imagine, like, because I always moan about not being able to play enough in between series with the Dutch Belgium situation, wanting to spend time with the kids, etc. So now all of a sudden it becomes like I'm going to get so much fucking better before next series is going to be fucking unreal,
Yeah, I think you could definitely integrate the studying into the streaming for sure.
All right,
and that would be a good idea.
Yeah, yeah, this is amazing. Wow. Okay, cool. I like this a lot.
All right, brother. Awesome. I'm glad we had a good time. So thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, of course.
All right, guys.
I'll see you tomorrow.
Talk to you guys soon.
Okay.
Yeah, see you tomorrow morning.
Thanks,
all right, man.
bro.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.